British press. People with schizophrenia are not very visible in society. Like all mental illnesses, there are no glaringly obvious visible symbols that point out to someone with schizophrenia. They're not noticeable in the same way someone with an outward physical disability is noticeable, for instance. Also, social withdrawal is a negative symptom of schizophrenia. So as a prognosis gets worse, people with schizophrenia are less likely to socialize with others. And for this reason, members of the public are likely to obtain almost all of their beliefs and attitudes towards schizophrenia and people with schizophrenia from the mass media, rather than, say, personal experience. So thus, by examining language patterns in the press, we can identify some of the inaccurate or prejudiced beliefs which give rise to stigma and internalized stigma. And these findings can in turn help improve patient outcomes and their quality of life. So that's the sort of impact of my research. Before we go further, it might be worth providing a brief summary of what schizophrenia is generally understood to be, because I know a lot of people do not understand specifically what schizophrenia is. And some people believe that schizophrenia is a multiple personality disorder, for instance. That's a misconception that's very popular. The DSM-5, which is the most prestigious, the most recent prestigious manual of diagnostic criteria, recommends diagnosing people with schizophrenia on the basis of abnormalities in the domains of delusions and hallucinations. So these are the big two sort of symptoms of schizophrenia: delusions and hallucinations. Delusions refer to fixed beliefs not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. So, for example, believing you're God or believing you're Jesus, or that someone else is the devil, for instance. And hallucinations refer to perception-like experiences that occur without an external stimulus. So a typical example is someone hearing voices that don't seem to have any outside auditory stimulus. Interestingly, schizophrenia is not nearly as rare as some people think. Various estimates from different studies suggest that about 1 in 100 people will experience symptoms of schizophrenia, such as hallucinations, such as delusions, during their lifetime. So in this talk, I'm interested in the sorts of topics that are distinctive in the tabloids and broadsheets reportage of schizophrenia. And there's some recent research, previous research into this topic. This previous research has observed that tabloid portrayals are more negative and sensationalistic. So you've got Barnes and Earnshaw there from 1993. And for instance, Clement and Foster found that tabloids were more likely to use intolerant labels like madman and psycho and maniac and things like that more often than the broadsheets. A more recent study by Bowen et al. Found that tabloids would focus more on violent implements, so weapons, and on notorious killers as being key topics. However, these studies have typically had less to say about the reporting in the broadsheets. Patterson, which I'm not quoting in the slides, made a hypothesis that the broadsheets would contain a greater variety of representations than the tabloids, but didn't go as far as carrying out a study himself. One of the reasons, I think, for this sidelining of the broadsheets is that previous analyses have tended to focus on similarities between the reportage rather than differences. And because both report on schizophrenia in the context of violence quite frequently, both the tabloids and the broadsheets, previous studies don't tell us very much about what makes their reportage distinct from one another. Thus, by examining distinctive topics in the way that I'm doing, this may lead to insights into maybe alternative ways in which people with schizophrenia are presented. So now we finally get round to my analysis itself. As my data, I'm using a 16 million word corpus that I built as part of a broader project examining representations of schizophrenia. So this was for my PhD. It contains all articles published between 2000 and 2015 by the British National Press that made explicit reference to schizophrenia or people with schizophrenia. Yeah, so my basic search criteria was schiz and a wildcard, which captured all articles featuring words beginning with that sequence of letters. So that's schizophrenia, schizophrenic, even words like schizo. And I also cleaned the corpus afterwards. I removed irrelevant articles. So it contains 5 tabloids: the Express, the Mail, the Star, the Sun, and the Mirror. and also for broadsheets, The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph and The Times. While strictly speaking, The Express and The Mail are what's called middle market newspapers, here I'm lumping them in with the tabloids because they tend to adopt a sensationalistic style, which is associated with tabloid reporting. They're more like tabloids, I think, than they are like broadsheets, even though, strictly speaking, they are middle market. So for my method, I conducted a contrastive, that's what was called a contrastive keywords analysis between the tabloid and broadsheet subcorpora. This meant that I compared the word frequency lists between the two corpora and identified words that were statistically significantly more frequent in one corpus relative to another. And I used the log likelihood metric to calculate statistical significance. I know log likelihood has fallen out of favour somewhat in recent years, but I did experiment with other metrics, and I found that the same sorts of topics were emerging in the data regardless. I think I experimented with maybe log ratio, was it? Maybe mutual information. It's a few years ago that I conducted this research, but I did experiment with different metrics. And because the number of keywords number in their thousands, I then chose to examine only the top 100 keywords with the highest significance score for the tabloids and the broadsheets, respectively. And then what I did is I grouped these keywords according to the shared topics that they typically occurred in. And these topics sort of emerged from the analysis itself. So let's begin with the tabloids. Notice here that I've not included all 100 keywords for the tabloids. Yeah. This is for two main reasons. One, all 100 just would not fit on one slide, and if they could, they'd be so small that you couldn't see them. And two, not all 100 could clearly be linked with topics. Some of the keywords were quite sort of incidental or boring. So for instance, other categories in the tabloids that I've not shown in this slide include things like temporal deixis and pronouns and things like that are more abstract, that are more formal categories that are not necessarily interesting for the purpose of this analysis that I'm doing, which is more interested in topics. So you'll notice that many of the tabloid keywords converge around the topic of crime. So this suggests that crime and violence is still a distinctive aspect of the tabloids reporting of schizophrenia relative to the broadsheets reporting. So to break these down, 7 of these refer to violent acts themselves. So for instance, you've got attack, attacked, kill and killed, so the same sorts of words appearing there. Another 2 refer to violent instruments. So we have a gun and knife there. And 3 refer to the gruesome aftermath, almost, of crimes committed by people with schizophrenia. So you've got references to death and blood and body, which are much more frequent again in the tabloids relative to the broadsheets. So typical examples in the tabloids referring to violent crime are as follows. Religious fanatic suffering from schizophrenia stabbed his retired computer analyst neighbour to death as he was doing odd jobs in his garage, and that's from the Mail Online. So in particular, these stories tend to portray people with schizophrenia as attacking their neighbours unexpectedly. That's a large theme in the tabloid reporting, thereby sort of linking maybe stories with this news value of unexpectedness, of things occurring randomly. And this has the potential, I think, to maybe instill fear in readers, as if anyone could be attacked at any moment by someone with schizophrenia who could be living next door. One thing about the language around crime in the tabloids that is very noticeable is the curious emphasis on detail. So look at the example of knife below. When the officers went inside, the defendant grabbed a kitchen knife, like the type used to cut vegetables, and began to get very aggressive. And that's again from the Mail Online. Now, this is curious because not only are we told what kind of knife it is, it's a kitchen knife, we're also told via this post-modifying comparative clause that it's like the type used to cut vegetables. There's 2 descriptions there that are provided of the knife. Clearly, the knife is something of importance to the journalist who's reporting on this story. And here are some other examples. When he was refused entry, he tried the nearby home of retired paediatrician Derek Robinson, 75, and his wife Jean, 60, armed with the biggest and strongest knife he could get from a local hardware store. So here we have a couple of attributive superlatives used to highlight the dangerousness of the weapon. It's not, again, it's not any old knife, it's the biggest and strongest knife. And the fact it's in quotation marks even seems to draw our attention to it. And again, here's another. This is a common feature of the reporting. These are not just selective examples that I'm showing. Jags stabbed her in the arm with a knife from the dishwasher. It's not difficult to see that the reference to the dishwasher is a little bit redundant here and very specific. One thing the reference to the dishwasher might achieve is that it might draw attention to maybe the domestic setting in which this event took place, and maybe contribute to this idea that people with schizophrenia, again, invade strangers' houses and kill them. It sort of brings these stories closer to home. It makes them more vivid. We can always imagine ourselves being the victim in these stories. And again, it maybe invokes fear in readers. We see the same emphasis on detail with the word blood, which, if you remember, was a key word in the tabloids. Looking at a 100-line sample of the word blood in a concordance, this reveals some sort of patterns in the reportage. Blood is rarely sort of just sitting still in the tabloids. Blood is pouring, blood is soaking, blood is leaking and drenching. It's getting everywhere. It's forming pools, it's splattering. Again, this curious emphasis on details, particularly gruesome details, scary details associated with the news story. So what can we conclude from this? I mean, journalists only have so much space in which to tell a story, and they have to be very, very selective about what to report on and what not to report on, especially in tabloids where the articles is usually a lot shorter. Evidently, details like the shape and size of a weapon and the arrangement of blood on surfaces is something that the tabloids have chosen to report on. Yeah. And again, this is probably because gruesome detail is viewed as newsworthy to journalists. They think it's what audiences want. For instance, Jukes, who in 2015, who examined the representation of crime in the media, suggests that violence and graphic imagery and visual spectacle are topics that the media likes to report on. Again, these are news values, yeah. So this explains some of these patterns which are emerging in the tabloids. By contrast, I should say that references to other things are a lot less infrequent, potentially more important things. Yeah, for instance, delusions and hallucinations. These symptoms that are the basis of schizophrenia, that probably cause these violent events to happen, are rarely mentioned at all. The examples quoted, the full articles, these words never occur. Comparing frequencies, words relating to hallucinations and delusions are just very, very infrequent. They occur almost as frequently together. So the word hallucination with a wildcard and delusion with a wildcard. Together, they occur almost as frequently as the one single word form shooting, which itself is only the fourth most frequent violence word in the tabloids. So this shows, again, yeah, the tabloids aren't so much interested in reporting on symptoms of schizophrenia, but they are very interested in reporting on gory details and scary details, such as the shape of the knife and things like that. A potential maybe sort of implication of this is that they draw attention away from issues of causality and more towards visual detail. So this is the other sort of news value of simplification here. Yeah, they like to simplify stories and not focus on causes and things like that, but to focus on more sort of trivial detail. However, there are other keywords relating to crime that do not refer specifically to violence itself. They're still in the broad topic of crime, but they don't specifically refer to violence. These tend to refer to other events relating to the crime. So, for instance, there is reference to legal roles associated with the sentencing of the criminal. So we've got attorney, we've got prosecutor, we've got judge. And there are also words referring to the context in which these sentences take place, for instance, court, crown court, and trial. And like Bowen et al. Found in an earlier study, there are also sort of names of notorious criminals emerging as key in the tabloids. And these people at some point have received a contested diagnosis of schizophrenia during their trials. For instance, Ian Brady, who killed children in the 60s, and Peter Sutcliffe, who killed people in the 80s. They're some of the names that are cropping up there. What all these keywords that I've shown on the previous slide have in common is that they tend to occur in articles where responsibility is problematized. So here is a typical example, a very long example. The delay in coming to court is due to multiple psychiatric evaluations. Prosecutors are seeking the death penalty, painting him as a calculated killer, driven by a floundering academic career and a breakup with his girlfriend. Meanwhile, Holmes, now 27, is pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. His public defenders insist he suffers from schizophrenia and wasn't in control of his actions when he plotted and carried out the attack. So the tabloids are reporting on this tension between viewing criminals as mentally ill or as morally culpable, as either being mad or bad, to put it another way. So on the one hand, the prosecutor wants the criminal to receive the harshest punishment, the death penalty, and yet the defendant claims that they were mentally ill when they carried out their crimes and should be sentenced on the grounds of diminished responsibility. So again, this discourse of blame is beginning to emerge from some of the tabloid keywords. Here's another example. I don't think he should be locked up in Broadmoor. It should be a normal prison. And then Sutcliffe mainly killed prostitutes in the streets of northern England. So this is a quote from the partner of one of the victims of Peter Sutcliffe, I believe. And in these examples, why it's not stated sort of directly, there is this suggestion that either people are masquerading as mentally ill in order to receive lighter sentences, or that their crimes are so heinous that they should forego medical treatment and receive a harsher punishment. So these are different aspects to this sort of discourse of blame that has emerged through the analysis. Other topics relating to crime include incarceration. So there are 4 words referring to places where people are incarcerated. This includes Broadmoor, Carstairs, which are both famous psychiatric prisons in the UK, and hospital and jail. And 3 of these refer to processes by which people are incarcerated or released. So we have arrested, we have jailed, and freed. Now, these words occur in contexts where the tabloids express anxieties about dangerous people with schizophrenia being within reach of the public. The word freed in particular, for instance, co-occurs with words that portray medical professionals as being inept at keeping the public safe from dangerous criminals. So the freeing of dangerous criminals is sometimes the result of blunders and mistakes and errors, which are all collocates, again, of freed. So let's see some examples. Blunders freed killer from mental hospital. A series of errors left a crazed killer at large to stab to death a hero detective. Some very sort of emotionally charged language here. A danger to the public for 20 years, but they freed maniac to kill policeman. So that's an express. So again, notice the use of like intolerant labels again, such as crazed and killer and maniac, that are used to portray those who have been released as more threatening and unpredictable. These words also suggest that these people are irredeemably dangerous. Yeah, a maniac is a maniac forever, really. And it almost suggests to us that these people should never be released and should always be kept at arm's length in these institutions. But still, the blame is being attributed to medical professionals who are inept and freeing them by mistake. So the analysis of the tabloid words has shown us certain distinctive aspects of their reporting of schizophrenia. So while crime is clearly a distinctive topic and a big topic in the tabloids, there are also more specific features that emerged from this analysis that don't necessarily relate specifically to just crime itself. So these include, for instance, this focus on the gruesome details of stories, which we saw with blood and knife. Also discussions about whether people who commit heinous crimes are deserving of medical treatment, and also anxieties around the deinstitutionalization of patients, yeah, particularly sort of mistakes made by health professionals that let these dangerous criminals enter communities. So now we're finished with the tabloids. I'm going to move on to keywords in the broadsheets. Just have a sip of my water. So the number of key topics emerging from the keyword, from the broadsheet keywords, is a little smaller. Here we only have 3 topics. Again, the rest of them are more formal categories and not really relating to schizophrenia very much. These three topics I have identified, though, are business and commerce, culture, and research and treatment. And I'm going to discuss some of those now. The topic with the most keywords in, by far, is culture. These refer to different genres. For instance, we have words referring to fine art, we have art, artists, exhibition. We have lots of words relating to creative writing, for instance, so books, story, theatre, things like that. And we also have cinema, and we have music as well. Yeah, lots of album names were captured by the search criteria. So, for example, Jerry Halliwell released an album called Schizophonic, I think in 1999. And there was also an album called 21st Century Schizoid Man, which was an album in the 80s, I think, by a band called King Crimson. And the reason these film and cinema tends to come up is because people with schizophrenia are often represented in film, and also in books as well. You get people with schizophrenia being the subject of books. But I wanted to interrogate this link between art and schizophrenia a little more closely. And to do that, I examined instances where these words, these key words relating to art, collocated with words relating to schizophrenia. So I examined concordant lines where keywords referring to art and culture collocated with the word schiz and a wild card. And what I found were lots of discussions relating to the link between psychosis and creativity. So here's an interesting example, and quite a typical, really, example of what's going on here. Some of the genes that predispose to schizophrenia might be carried by artists, and in many cases play a factor in their creativity. But because the artists do not develop full-blown schizophrenia and are able to direct their creativity, they are able to pass the genes on to their children. So this is part of even a broader discussion, even in the scholarly literature, of the relationship between psychosis and creative thought. More recently, Prentke, for instance, in 2001, suggests that psychosis is just an extreme form of creative thinking, which is associated with sort of making lateral associations and intuition. Likewise, on these grounds, the literary critic, Terry Eagleton, has drawn attention to a link between the language that people with schizophrenia produce and poetry. For instance, this reliance on metaphor, and again, lateral meanings and things like that. And this in turn reflects an even older historical association between madness and genius. One of the earliest quotations alluding to this association is the one where Seneca quoted Aristotle saying, "There is no genius without a touch of madness." And you've probably heard variations on that quote over time. Now, looking at the sort of implications of these representations, they're a little bit, apparently my slides are freezing, so I might just slow down a little bit. So these representations are a little bit ambivalent. On the one hand, they link schizophrenia with positive human qualities, i.e. creativity. Okay, right, apparently everyone's on the same slide now, which is good to hear. Yeah, apologies for using my phone. I knew some difficulties like this would arise. So on the one hand, they link schizophrenia with more positive human qualities like creativity, which is a far cry from their depiction in the tabloids as this irredeemable, dangerous murderers that go around invading houses and killing people. However, on the other hand, people with schizophrenia are still being ruled out as being too creative to be artists, almost as if they're people who are unable to recognise their creative thoughts as fiction. Yeah, they're still being framed as different. So I'll move on to the next slide. Maybe I'll wait just two seconds for everyone to catch up with the slide if it's slow. So the second largest topic in the broadsheets is research and treatment around schizophrenia. Some of these words refer to treatment according to what's called a biomedical model of schizophrenia. So that is viewing disorders as this collection of symptoms that needs to be treated with pharmaceuticals. Yeah, this is the biomedical approach to mental illness. Definitely sort of current in psychiatry today. So for instance, we have the words human genome and project, which refer unsurprisingly, to the Human Genome Project. And this was a collaboration between scientists carried out between 1990 and 2003 that attempted to map what's called the basis of the human genome. They were trying to map DNA, basically. And by doing this, scientists had hoped that they would be able to determine mutations in a person's DNA, which could be used to sort of readily identify the genetic basis for schizophrenia. Yeah, they could identify mutations in this genome that you could point at and say this person has schizophrenia because of this mutation. That's what they were trying to do. It was inconclusive, and because the schizophrenia is one of many sort of more complex genetic disorders. So these bases sort of interact with each other in complex ways, and there are environmental factors to take into account. So the project was inconclusive, just to sort of end that thought. Other keywords refer to pharmaceuticals. So the word AstraZeneca refers to a large pharmaceutical company which produces an antipsychotic drug called Seroquel. Incidentally, many of the words, if not all of the words in the business and commerce category relate to this story. So for instance, company, executive and sales, which are all keywords in the business and commerce category, are all collocates of AstraZeneca. So this is a big part of the broadsheet reporting. So here's an example, just to give you a flavour of how the broadsheets talk about this. One of AstraZeneca's best-selling drugs, Seroquel for schizophrenia, lost US patent protection in March, while the patent on Nexium for ulcers expires in the US in 2014. The two generated 10.3 billion, 6.4 billion pounds in sales last year, and that's from the Telegraph. So here you can see that schizophrenia is mentioned more in passing. I don't think this is a particularly interesting representation of schizophrenia. The emphasis is more on the business dealings of the company, yeah, and the reference to schizophrenia is more incidental because of the drug that's being produced. However, two keywords signal other ways of viewing schizophrenia outside of this standard biomedical model, and these are a little more interesting, I think. The word Freud, for instance, refers to the famous Viennese psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and lying refers to a famous psychiatrist from the 60s. He was a pioneer of what was called anti-psychiatry, so he challenged this dominant biomedical approach. So he often sort of saw schizophrenia developing because of bad communication strategies in the family. It took a more environmental focus of schizophrenia. It wasn't so much just about symptoms and treating symptoms. It was about understanding the root sort of causes of schizophrenia that emerged in childhood, yeah, and that's what really links Freud and Lying's perspective of schizophrenia. So these words occur in articles which discuss the positives of these more humane, potentially, approaches to treatment that deviate from this standard biomedical model. In particular, again, they extol approaches to treatment of schizophrenia that take into account environmental causes and causes that originate in childhood, rather than just sort of these physical symptoms. So I'll just read these out. Freud was among the first physicians to treat the mentally ill in a humane, non-surgical way, and that's from the Telegraph. And Lying has been notorious as the man who blamed schizophrenia on families, but those who dismiss him on that basis have to ask if any attempt to understand a person's mental state can be made without reference to their closest relationships, and that's from The Guardian. So again, more positive representations of alternative approaches to psychiatry. So just to summarise what we saw in the broadsheets, what was distinctive about the broadsheets reportage relative to the tabloids? Well, first, there was a much larger emphasis on schizophrenia in the context of art and culture. That was the biggest category that emerged from the list of keywords. And these representations drew links between psychoticism and creative thought. There was also much more of an interest in the science behind schizophrenia, which we just discussed, particularly an interest in non-biomedical approaches to treating schizophrenia via figures such as Liang and Freud as well. But there's also sort of a mention of the biomedical sort of model as well, with reference to AstraZeneca and Seroquel and that sort of thing. So the analysis has therefore revealed a number of topics salient in the tabloids and broadsheets. Importantly, many of the topics do not refer to violent crime itself. For instance, in the tabloids, there were discussions around problematized blame and on incarceration. By contrast, there were no words distinctive in the broadsheets that referred to crime specifically. Instead, there was this emphasis on discussions around psychoticism and creativity and on different forms of treatment. But one thing I think that some of these representations have in common is that they both contribute to the view that people with schizophrenia are somehow very different. Yeah. In the case of the tabloids, this is a view of people with schizophrenia as undesirably different, to go back to Goffman's quote, definition of stigma earlier. They're undesirably different, as they're dangerous murderers that invade homes. But in the case of the broadsheets, this is a view of people with schizophrenia as potentially desirably different, as in the case of creatives, as being inherently creative. But given that symptoms of schizophrenia are so common, as we saw in one of the intro slides, the press may choose to, in the future, make its reporting a little more tolerant by providing representations of people with schizophrenia that present them as normal, everyday people. You know? And they might be in the data set, but they're just not distinct parts of the data set. So before I finish, there are some potential limitations to this. As I just said, these findings show us only what is distinctive about the representations in the tabloids and broadsheets. They don't tell us what is similar. And I know some previous research has looked into that. They find that violence is still a massive category and that both tabloids and broadsheets typically represent schizophrenia and people with schizophrenia in the context of violence. Another thing is that maybe the case that the difference in reporting that I found here is more due to stylistic differences rather than a different perspective on the topic. And this is something to watch out for, I think, when carrying out keyword analysis like this. For instance, the identical words that I found, such as art and book and books and writers, they all occur as keywords for the broadsheets in a study carried out by Baker et al., looking at the representation of Muslims. So we're finding that the same sorts of keywords seem to be emerging, whether the press are reporting on Muslims or on people with schizophrenia. It's because of the style of the paper, not so much because of their particular view of this topic. So again, that's something to watch out for. I thought I'll just mention future projects as well. So in sort of future talks and publications, I'll be looking more closely at some of the topics that arose from this analysis. Again, this was more of a sort of broad level macro view of some of the research that I've been doing, looking at tabloids and broadsheets. For example, in a future talk, I'll be looking more closely at this discourse of blame, which is a huge topic in the broadsheets. So it's distinctive in the broadsheets reporting. So I'll be looking at how the press manipulate language in subtle ways in order to position the reader according to a particular stance relating to blame. So I'll be talking about that next in my next UCREL talk. I'll also look more closely in future at the language used by the tabloids that draws attention to gruesome aspects of stories. You tend to find that tabloids like to frame these tragic stories as if they were horror films or as if they were thrillers. The way they write about these criminals and draw attention to things like knives and things like that. So that's an idea of future projects. But I think I've more or less done there. Hopefully you find that reasonably interesting, and I'd be interested to answer any questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think it's the time for question and answer sessions. We have 15 minutes. So you can raise your hand and then you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.